When Jasmine Crockett uncovers hidden documents linking Clarence Thomas to luxury gifts, secret trips, and undisclosed real estate funded by a billionaire, she doesn't stay silent. She confronts him live before the nation, on his turf, under oath. He mocks her. She detonates the truth. Can the woman he dismissed as a nobody bring his entire legacy crashing down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The file landed on Jasmine Crockett's desk without a name, without a return address, just a thick envelope stuffed with damning detail. Page after page listed extravagant trips: Clarence Thomas sailing on a Bali yacht, retreating to a private Adirondacks estate, and accepting lavish gifts worth hundreds of thousands from billionaire Harlan Crow. Jasmine's hands tightened on the paper. Her face stayed calm, but her eyes burned. This wasn't just luxury. It was a systematic insult to the very law he was sworn to uphold. It was power mocking justice in broad daylight. Then came the recording. A voice file, scratchy but unmistakable. Clarence Thomas laughing in a private setting, his words dripping with contempt. She's articulate, but still loud. Still got that ghetto chip. The words sliced through Jasmine like broken glass. He wasn't just sneering at some faceless critic. He was sneering at her, at Jasmine Crockett. The insult wasn't casual. It was calculated, dripping with the belief he could never be touched. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let the venomous sentence repeat in her mind, not to wound her, but to sharpen her resolve. She picked up the printouts again, her jaw set, her silence more dangerous than fury. She knew this wasn't a headline for a newspaper or a whisper in a corridor. This was a weapon too sharp to waste in shadows. If it was going to matter, it had to be unsheathed on the biggest stage possible. She closed the file, slid the recording across the desk, and whispered only to herself, "Not the press. Not tomorrow. In front of him. In front of everyone." Her decision was final. She would not leak. She would not beg for coverage. She would face Clarence Thomas under the blinding lights of a live hearing. And when she did, his own words and his own corruption would bury him deeper than any journalist ever could. The silence of Jasmine's office was gone, replaced by the roar of a packed chamber. The decision she had made, not the press, not tomorrow, but here in his face, followed her like a drumbeat as she stepped into the hearing room. This was no ordinary session. This was Congress summoning a Supreme Court justice to answer for his own ethics, a spectacle so rare it felt like history itself was holding its breath. The air vibrated with anticipation, every camera poised, every seat filled, every eye waiting for the clash. The broadcast lights snapped on, flooding the chamber in unforgiving brightness. Millions of Americans watched in real time as the gavel struck and the hearing began. Staffers shuffled papers, senators shifted uneasily, but the energy was different, more like the final round of a heavyweight fight than a legal proceeding. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward, pens frozen above notepads, their instincts screaming that the next few minutes would make front-page history. And then he appeared. Clarence Thomas strode into the chamber with the swagger of a man who believed nothing and no one could touch him. His black robe rippled behind him, a symbol of authority twisted into a costume of defiance. He didn't look nervous. He didn't even look concerned. Instead, he leaned down toward his aide, lips curled into a smirk, and whispered just loud enough to be overheard. "Let the woke warrior bark. I'll crush her in 2 sentences." The words weren't strategy. They were a taunt. The chamber shifted with unease as his grin widened. It wasn't the smile of innocence. It was the smirk of a man daring anyone to try and drag him down. Jasmine sat at the committee table, watching him with an expression carved from stone. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. For her, this was no longer about questions or procedure. This was about survival, the survival of justice itself against the sneer of corruption. The chairman called the hearing to order. The cameras zoomed in. Jasmine was given the floor. She leaned into her microphone, ready to speak, but Thomas lunged first. His voice, booming and dripping with mockery, sliced through the room. "Ms. Crockett, I'm surprised you even know what the Constitution says." The words detonated like a grenade. Gas rippled across the audience. Senators exchanged stunned looks. A few staffers froze in mid-step, papers trembling in their hands. The insult wasn't clever. It was brutal, raw, and deliberate, meant to humiliate her before she could even draw her first weapon. The microphones caught every syllable, amplifying his sneer into millions of living rooms across America. And then, silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Every camera swung toward Jasmine, lenses waiting, hungry for her reaction. The chamber was no longer just a hearing room, it was an arena, and everyone watching knew they were seconds away from witnessing either her collapse or her rise. The insult still hung in the air, thick and stinging, but Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned into her mic, voice calm and lethal. Justice Thomas, do you recall the trip to Indonesia in July 2019? The question hit like a blade drawn slowly. Controlled, deliberate. No theatrics. Just truth with a pulse. Thomas didn't miss a beat. No, Congresswoman, he said flatly. I don't recall any such trip. He forced a smile, eyes scanning the room. And all of my travel has been properly disclosed. It wasn't just denial, it was defiance. Jasmine said nothing. She turned and the screen behind her came to life. First slide, Thomas on a yacht off the coast of Bali, drink in hand, standing beside billionaire Harlan Crow. Date stamped July 18th, 2019. Next slide, business class flight itinerary with Thomas's name. Washington, D.C. to Denpasar, round trip. Total cost, $42,000. Paid by Crow's private company. Not a single dollar disclosed. More slides followed. Receipts from five-star resorts, private drivers, catered dinners with corporate executives. Total value of the trip, over $260,000. Jasmine looked straight at him. None of this appears on your financial disclosures. None of it reported to the American people. Then she hit play. Thomas's own voice caught on a recording. You people always make it about race. The words dropped like a hammer. No spin, no context. Just the sound of power speaking when it thought no one was listening. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Pens froze. Phones dropped. One aide covered her mouth. The clip ended. And for the first time in decades, Clarence Thomas had nothing to say. His lips parted. Closed. No sound. And in front of the entire country, he crumbled into silence. The silence after the recording wasn't just heavy. It was nuclear. Thomas's own voice had exposed him, and the whole room could feel the blast radius. But instead of swallowing it, he erupted. He slammed both hands on the desk, eyes burning, face flushed deep red. He stood so fast his chair screeched back against the marble. Then came the outburst. You're a clown, trash in a suit. You don't belong in the same room with me. The words weren't political. They weren't even tactical. They were raw, hateful, and straight from the gut of a man who'd just been cornered. And worse, they were loud. Loud enough to echo through every hallway of power in Washington and every living room across America. Shock rippled across the chamber like a lightning strike. One senator turned away in visible disgust. Another whispered, Jesus Christ, and sank back in his seat. A congressional aide gasped audibly and covered her face. Reporters stopped writing. Cameramen adjusted their lenses in disbelief. In that instant, Clarence Thomas didn't sound like a justice. He sounded like a man unraveling at the seams. But Jasmine? Jasmine didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just rose, slow, steady, precise, like a blade being pulled from velvet. Her eyes locked on him, cold as steel, and her voice dropped to a calm that could slice through bone. Every insult you throw at me is proof of your fear, she said, and today the fear belongs to you. The room didn't breathe. The insult had been nuclear, but her answer was surgical. No shouting, no theatrics, just truth. Brutal, elegant truth. And in that moment, the entire balance of power shifted. The courtroom no longer belonged to the robe, but to the woman he tried to humiliate. Cameras caught everything, his trembling hand gripping the edge of the table, his lips twitching to speak and failing, his stare, wild, cornered, cracked. It wasn't just a collapse, it was a reckoning, And it was happening live. The room was still reeling from Thomas's outburst, his voice still echoing in people's ears, his anger still smeared across his face like blood. But Jasmine didn't give him time to recover. She wasn't done, not even close. She turned a page in her binder and held it up without a word. The screen behind her changed again, this time to a scanned document with 2 columns, bold numbers, and one very familiar name. This, she said clearly, is a wire transfer from Harlan Crow's private trust fund. It covers full tuition, 4 years, at a private boarding school for your grandnephew. Her voice was calm but sharp. Over $150,000, paid in full, and not a single cent disclosed to the public. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "That's not true," he snapped, trying to get ahead of the blow. "That money never came to me. I didn't know the details. It was handled by family." He waved a hand like he could swat it all away. "I was never involved." Jasmine nodded, as if expecting the lie. Then she turned back to the screen and clicked again. A new document appeared, an enrollment contract, signed and dated. At the bottom of the form, in black ink, was a single signature, Harlan Crow. The date aligned exactly with the wire transfer. "You weren't involved," she asked. "Then why does the man funding your luxury vacations also sign as guarantor on your nephew's education?" She let the words hang a beat, then delivered the final cut. "And in case you plan to deny it, this signature has already been verified by a forensic handwriting expert. It's 100% authentic. That's Crow's name on your family's bill, and there's no more room to pretend it isn't." A ripple of murmurs spread across the chamber like a wave crashing over glass. Reporters sat up straighter. Staffers leaned in. One Republican senator shook his head and muttered under his breath, "This is indefensible." Thomas didn't respond. He didn't even lift his head. His hands gripped the table, white-knuckled. His eyes dropped to the floor. The camera zoomed in, catching the way his jaw clenched and shoulders stiffened, as if holding back something, rage, shame, or both. For the first time, Clarence Thomas looked exactly like what he had always believed he could never become, cornered, exposed, and small. The chamber was already breathless. Thomas hadn't spoken in over a minute, and the silence clung to him like smoke. But just when it seemed like he might gather himself, Jasmine struck again. This wasn't a rebuttal. This was the kill shot. Thomas finally looked up, lips trembling, voice barely holding shape. This is beneath the dignity of the court?" It came out weak, broken, like he was trying to climb out of a hole he dug with his own hands. But Jasmine didn't even blink. She didn't let him finish the sentence. "No," she said, turning the page with cold precision. "What's beneath the dignity of the court is this." She tapped her tablet. The screen behind her changed instantly, now showing a leaked internal email, dated February 10th, 2021, from Clarence Thomas to an associate of Harlan Crow. The words lit up in front of Congress and the nation. "Would Harlan be willing to assist with purchasing a home for my mother?" Something modest, quiet, off record. The temperature in the room dropped like glass shattering. Jasmine didn't slow down. She hit the next slide. Boom, a property deed, a single-story house in Savannah, Georgia, purchased in May 2021. Listed value, $267,000. Buyer, Walnut Grove, a holding company directly tied to Crow's network. And then the final nail, a notarized sales contract, certified and timestamped, bearing Harlan Crow's unmistakable signature. "You asked a billionaire to buy your mother a house," Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the noise. "He did, and you never disclosed it. Not to the court, not to Congress, not to the American people." The chamber erupted. Senators whispered in shock. One staffer dropped a clipboard. Reporters scrambled, typing furiously as the words "off-record real estate deal" ricocheted across every phone, feed, and live broadcast. One microphone caught a senator muttering under his breath, "That's it. That's the end." And Clarence Thomas? He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He didn't even shift in his seat. He sat frozen, stone-faced, jaw locked, eyes hollow, like someone who'd just heard a verdict without a judge needing to say a word. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. It wasn't a debate. It was a public dismantling of power, one receipt at a time. And the whole country was watching the fall. The screen behind Jasmine faded to black, but the silence it left behind was louder than any explosion. Thomas remained frozen, locked in the same posture, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, eyes pinned to the table like looking up might make it worse. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Across the room, no one moved. It was as if the oxygen had been pulled from the building. But outside that chamber, the world had already caught fire. The ripple effect was instant. Phones began buzzing up and down the rows of aides and press. Reporters' screens lit up with simultaneous alerts, their eyes darting from devices to cameras, then back again in disbelief. Editors shouted down phone lines. Press officers scrambled. Newsrooms from D.C. to New York to L.A. broke into live coverage. There was no waiting for confirmation. The footage was already live. The evidence projected 10 feet tall, and the silence of Clarence Thomas said more than any denial ever could. CNN cut away from its midday panel. Fox News hesitated, then joined. MSNBC ran a breaking banner before Jasmine had even left the mic. One anchor exhaled into his feed, stunned. This is not a political takedown. This is a real-time collapse of credibility at the highest level of American justice. His co-anchor shook her head silently beside him. Inside the chamber, the power shift was unmistakable. Republican senators, just hours ago firm in posture, firm in party line, now sat in absolute stillness. One pressed his thumb against his temple, as if willing himself to disappear. Another leaned so far back in his chair he nearly faded from view. The ones closest to Thomas, once positioned to defend him if needed, now shifted away ever so slightly, like a reflex. No one said a word. Not one voice rose in his defense. And that silence? It spoke volumes. They weren't standing with him. They were creating distance, quietly, quickly, tactically, protecting themselves, protecting the party, but not the man at the center of the storm. Across the press box, a senior political correspondent from the Washington Post stopped scribbling halfway through her notes. She leaned to her colleague beside her, eyes wide but voice low, almost reverent, as if describing a historical event unfolding in slow motion. This is it. This is the moment. Clarence Thomas just got taken down, right inside the very room where he once sat untouchable. No one clapped. There were no chants. No gavel needed to strike. Because when power breaks, it doesn't need an announcement. It just collapses, silently, spectacularly, and leaves the world watching in stunned disbelief. And today it happened on camera, in front of the nation. And no one, especially not Clarence Thomas, could stop it. The cameras were still rolling when the first retaliation came in, not from Clarence Thomas himself, but from the fortress around him. His office, long silent through the storm, finally released a public statement. But it didn't address the $267,000 home. It didn't deny the boarding school payments, the Bali yacht trip, or the forged silence surrounding it all. Instead, it reached for the only defense it had left: distraction. Crockett only wants attention. That was it. No evidence, no correction, no apology, just a thinly veiled attack on her character, thrown out like a flare to draw fire away from the wreckage. The line landed like a last gasp, a desperate attempt to flip the narrative and smear the one voice bold enough to speak the truth. It wasn't just petty, it was calculated. And it didn't work, because the media wasn't done digging, and what they found next turned smoke into wildfire. Within the hour, 2 major outlets dropped new bombshells. According to public real estate records and verified wire transfers, Harlan Crow had quietly purchased multiple properties under the names of Clarence Thomas's relatives, including a 2-bedroom townhouse in Atlanta, a beachfront condo in Hilton Head, and a lake cabin registered to a cousin in Georgia. All were valued between $150,000 and $300,000. All were paid in full. None of them appeared in any of Thomas's financial disclosures. Not one line, not one mention, not a word. One journalist posted the transaction records live on air. Another broke down the LLC trail connecting the homes back to Crow's holding companies. A third, standing on the courthouse steps, said flatly, "This is systemic. This isn't an oversight. This is concealment with intent. The tone across networks had changed. No longer asking, is this wrong? But now, how long has it been covered up? Inside the Capitol, the silence from Thomas's allies was deafening. Not a single Republican senator stepped forward to defend him. Not one issued a counterstatement. Even his longtime supporters stared down at their desks or checked their phones, as if distance could undo association. Their body language spoke the truth none of them dared say out loud. They knew the walls were collapsing, and they wanted to be far away when they fell. And in the middle of that chaos, Jasmine Crockett stood exactly where she had started, unmoved, unshaken, and unafraid. When a group of reporters rushed to her on the steps outside the chamber, shoving microphones in her face, she didn't flinch. She looked directly into the lens of the lead camera and said it plain, clear, and without hesitation. This isn't about me. This isn't personal. This is about the rot at the very core of justice itself. No soundstage could have written it better. No spin team could unwrite it, and no Supreme Court robe could cover it anymore. The Capitol hadn't slept in 72 hours. News trucks still lined the sidewalks, cables curling like vines beneath temporary scaffolding. Satellite dishes pointed at the sky. Anchors stood in the cold, narrating the fall of a Supreme Court justice like war correspondents watching a city under siege. Inside the building, staffers whispered in hallways, glancing over shoulders as if the building itself were listening. The air was thick with something no one could name, but everyone could feel. The political earthquake had already struck, but now came the aftershocks. Jasmine Crockett's final blow, the house, the documents, the signature, had shattered the illusion. But it was the silence that followed that made it permanent. Clarence Thomas hadn't denied it. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't even looked up. In the hours that followed, a different kind of storm began to brew, one not driven by politics or party, but by the law itself. A respected legal nonprofit, long known for holding judges accountable, stepped forward first. Their statement didn't open with emotion. It opened with citations, case numbers, docket references, specific rulings. All 12 were laid out in stark black and white. 12 cases Clarence Thomas had weighed in on while financially entangled with Harlan Crow. No speculation, no headlines. Just facts that burned hotter than any headline ever could. By midday, the organization filed a formal petition demanding that Justice Thomas recuse himself from all 12 cases, past and present. Their language was clinical, but the implications were nuclear. A pattern of undisclosed financial entanglement constitutes a direct violation of judicial ethics and erodes public trust in the impartiality of the court. Their legal brief ran over 40 pages. It included timelines, property records, signed contracts, and sworn statements. Every line drove the same message deeper into the system. He could no longer be trusted to rule without bias, and that message hit its mark. Because just hours later, in a move no one thought possible, the judicial branch itself stirred. A federal ethics oversight panel, rarely heard from, even more rarely activated, announced a formal inquiry into Clarence Thomas's conduct. The press gasped. Law professors rechecked the language twice. It was real. It was happening. And it marked the first time in modern American history that a sitting Supreme Court justice would face an active ethics investigation at the federal level. This wasn't symbolic anymore. This was systemic. Newsrooms across the country ran live breakdowns. Legal experts were pulled from studios and universities, flown into Washington to explain how the impossible had become inevitable. This isn't just about corruption, one anchor said. This is about the legal immune system of a nation finally attacking the cancer it ignored for decades. Meanwhile, inside the Supreme Court building, time moved differently. The marble columns still stood tall. The security guards still nodded to each other. The structure did its best to pretend that nothing had changed. But within its walls, people moved with unease. Clerks who had once carried briefs with quiet confidence now avoided eye contact. Internal emails turned colder. The quiet hum of ritual had been replaced by something else, tension. And in the center of that tension, at the very heart of the institution, sat Clarence Thomas. On the third day, during a scheduled procedural session, Photographers were briefly allowed into the chamber. One of them, an Associated Press veteran with over 20 years covering the Hill, lifted her camera and caught a single frame. It would go on to become the most reprinted image of the year. In the photo, Justice Thomas is seated behind the bench. His robe is draped perfectly, as always. His hands rest in front of him, clasped together. But what made the image unforgettable was everything else. His head is down. His eyes are not on the speaker, or the documents, or even the chamber itself. They're fixed on the desk in front of him, unmoving, defeated, hollow. No one needed to ask what he was thinking. The silence said enough. This was not the posture of a man ready to fight. This was the posture of a man who knew the fight was already over. Across social media, the photo spread without needing a caption. Reporters called it the moment power collapsed into posture. Editors refused to crop it. Citizens, on both sides of the aisle, paused when they saw it. Because there, in the most sacred hall of American law, sat a man who had once ruled from on high, now surrounded by a storm he could no longer control. The reaction across Washington was just as revealing. No senator, Republican or Democrat, issued a defense. Not one stood in front of cameras to vouch for his character, his record, or his integrity. There were no press conferences, no op-eds, no spin, only silence. Even the most hardline loyalists knew stepping into that fire would only burn them too. For a court that had long stood above scrutiny, this was uncharted territory. The justices, once symbols of untouchable authority, were now facing a reckoning. The people, watching from screens, court steps, and dinner tables, were no longer asking, "Did this happen?" They were asking, "How long has this been protected?" And while Clarence Thomas remained on the bench, the weight of everything pressing against him, documents, investigations, public outrage, was undeniable. The image of him that day, head bowed and mouth sealed, would come to represent more than a man. It would become a symbol of a fractured moment in American justice. A reminder that no position, no title, no robe is immune to the truth when it's dragged into the light. Because this wasn't just about Clarence Thomas anymore. It was about what the system had allowed and what it would do next. The storm inside the Capitol had quieted, but the aftershocks were still being felt across the country. Cameras were powered down, microphones unplugged. Staffers moved slowly now, some in stunned silence, others in quiet reflection. And yet, outside those massive stone walls, the eyes of a nation still followed her. As Jasmine Crockett stepped out from the hearing chamber and into the fading light of day, the weight of what she had done wasn't just in the headlines, it was in the air itself. The marble steps leading from the Capitol entrance had never felt steeper. For decades, they had carried the footsteps of men in polished shoes, escorted by privilege and silence. But now, with each slow, composed step, a new image was being carved into American history. The figure of a black congresswoman, head high, having just confronted a Supreme Court justice and cracked open the myth of untouchability. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but her expression held the quiet focus of someone who knew this moment was bigger than applause. There were no chants, no fireworks, no celebration. Only something heavier, a kind of sacred stillness, as if everyone watching sensed they had witnessed something irreversible. Behind her, the Capitol stood like a monument to everything she had just challenged. And in front of her, the crowd opened slightly, parting just enough to reveal something that made her stop. Near the barricades, not more than 5 feet away, stood a girl. 9, maybe 10 years old. Skin like hers, hair braided tightly, held by 2 bright blue ribbons. She wasn't shouting, wasn't holding a phone. She was holding a sign made from a piece of cardboard, the edges curled from gripping it too hard. The letters weren't perfect. Some were crooked, some too big, but they were bold, outlined in pink glitter, and written in all caps. "I want to be Jasmine Crockett when I grow up." Time seemed to slow. The noise around them dimmed, and for a moment, there were only 2 people in the world, the girl holding the sign and the woman who had just changed the course of justice. Jasmine blinked, not from surprise, but from the emotion that hit her like a wave breaking in her chest. The cameras caught none of this. The networks were still airing debate panels. But right here, in the dying sunlight, was the reason she had walked into that hearing in the first place. She stepped forward slowly, one foot in front of the other, until she reached the girl. Then she crouched down, not like a politician stooping for a photo, but like a woman making space for something holy. Her eyes met the girl's. Neither of them said anything for a second. The girl's lip quivered slightly, as if she couldn't believe the real Jasmine Crockett was standing there. Then Jasmine leaned in closer. Her voice was low, warm, unshaken. "And you will, but justice cannot wait for tomorrow." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed like a promise stitched into time. The girl's eyes welled with tears, but she smiled, nodding fast. Jasmine gently touched the edge of her sign, then stood up again, slow and steady. She didn't turn back to wave at the crowd. She simply nodded once to the little girl, then continued walking down the steps, every movement silent but monumental. That image, Jasmine leaving the Capitol, the child watching her like she was watching the future, would never go viral. It wouldn't trend. It wouldn't even make the official news packages. But those who saw it firsthand would never forget it, because it wasn't a performance. It was a moment of transfer between generations, between eras, between what had always been and what had just been made possible. Inside the newsroom of a national cable network, a young producer shouted from behind the glass wall, "We need to cut to the ending. Jasmine just left the building." The anchor nodded. Cameras refocused, editors scrambled. And then, after nearly 4 days of continuous coverage, the final segment of the national broadcast rolled. There was no music, no flashy graphics, just a wide shot of the Capitol fading into the evening light, followed by B-roll footage of Jasmine's hearing, her voice, the documents, the silence of Clarence Thomas. And then the anchor, speaking slowly, carefully, with the weight of history in his throat, closed the show with one line. "Clarence Thomas, from untouchable to under investigation, and the woman he once mocked made it happen." The screen faded to black. No outro, no applause, just silence. But across the country, living rooms were still lit by the fading glow of that closing line. In some homes, families sat in silence. In others, heads nodded slowly, in quiet recognition. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't partisan theater or viral scandal. It was something deeper, something long overdue. They had watched a man who believed himself above consequence finally face it. And they had watched a woman, calm, unshaken, relentless, deliver that consequence, not with vengeance, but with truth. And outside the Capitol, beneath the fading light of a DC sky, a little girl with blue ribbons in her hair held her sign just a little higher. Because now she knew something she hadn't known yesterday. She didn't have to wait to grow up to see justice. Justice had just walked past her, and it had whispered back, "Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.